A world-renowned pianist once mocked a blind black teenager, inviting him to play piano as a joke. He has incredible gift. Unaware he was speaking to a musical genius. "Hey kid, want to play something for us? Bet you know Happy Birthday," said Vincent Sterling, his voice ringing through the Lincoln Art Center as quiet laughter rippled among New York's elite. 16-year-old David Thompson stood silently by the Steinway, gripping his white cane. Tension hung in the air. He had come with his public school music teacher, who had somehow managed to get 2 seats to the city's most exclusive benefit concert. Vincent adjusted his sleek Armani tux, smiling smugly at the crowd of donors and critics. At 42, he was hailed as a master of Chopin, with international tours and million-dollar deals. To him, the presence of a blind teenager highlighted the flaws in inclusive cultural programs. "Come on, don't be shy," he added, full of condescension. "I'm sure our wonderful donors would love to see where their generosity goes." Patricia Wells, the foundation's director, whispered a protest to her assistant, but chose not to step in. Vincent was, after all, the headline act and the main draw of the evening. David took a steady breath, cane in hand. No one knew he practiced 8 hours a day on a battered keyboard in a church basement. No one knew that by age 3, he could mimic entire symphonies after one listen. And no one guessed that, while they dismissed him as a misfit, he was quietly absorbing every word, every tone, every insult. "Actually," David said, his voice steady and clear, "I'd rather play some Bach." Vincent laughed. "Bach? What could you possibly play, son?" But the smirk was about to vanish. "Partita number 2 in C minor," David answered calmly, "although it may be a little too complex for tonight's audience." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The room grew still. Something about the boy's posture and voice told a few guests they weren't witnessing a gimmick. They were on the edge of a revelation. If this story of grace under pressure speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and watch how a cruel joke turned into the most unforgettable moment in New York's music scene. Vincent's smile faded. That particular piece was among Bach's most emotionally and technically difficult works. "Too advanced for the audience?" he echoed sharply. "You're talking to people who support the world's best orchestras. Do you know who you're speaking to?" The audience nodded along. Margaret Rothschild, heir to a banking empire, murmured, "Unbelievable. These kids need to learn respect." David didn't react, but his grip on the cane shifted. His hands were now relaxed, precise, composed, ready. "Vincent," interrupted Dr. Harrison Webb, Boston Symphony's conductor, "perhaps we should move along." "No," Vincent snapped. "Young David here questions the crowd's refinement. Let's see if he can back it up." He sat at the piano and performed the partita's intro with exaggerated flair. "You see, David," he said, "this isn't about notes. It's about emotional maturity, something you gain with time. Are you sure you're ready for this?" But Vincent had no idea David had memorized his every flourish. Since the crash that took both his vision and his parents, music became David's lifeline. It wasn't just talent, it was survival. His Aunt Deborah, a custodian at the local conservatory, had slipped him rare recordings and braille scores. David had memorized them all, understanding not just the music but the history, the soul behind each piece. "Dr. Sterling," David said, deliberately misusing the title, "you played in D major. The original is in C minor." A stunned silence fell. Vincent flushed. He'd changed keys on purpose to trip the boy up, never expecting public correction. "Obviously a test," Vincent stammered, his smooth voice cracking. "Just checking his ear." "I understand," David said evenly. "Then you must also know Bach wrote this after losing his wife. It's not just music, it's grief in motion." Vincent felt the words like a slap. His playing, while perfect, had always lacked the heart real listeners craved but never commented on. "Well done," Vincent muttered. The cracks in his demeanor were showing. "Since you're so full of theory, why don't you play and show us what it means?" David stepped toward the piano, gently propping his cane beside it. His fingers found the keys like they belonged there. "Before I start," he said, addressing the room, "has anyone here ever lost everything and had to build themselves back, note by note?" This time, the silence was thoughtful, deep. Guests leaned in. Something profound was unfolding. Vincent suddenly felt cold. The boy's calm energy, the quiet control in his movements, it all hinted that tonight's performance wouldn't go according to plan. What no one could see was that every smirk, every patronizing comment, every slight had been turned into fuel. David had taken their cruelty and forged it into something unshakable, and he was ready to prove that mocking someone who's already lost everything can come at a high cost. David's words hovered like a final warning. The room was still. Vincent was now visibly annoyed. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Play or get off the stage. We don't have time for drama." "Honestly," Margaret Rothschild said aloud, "this is why standards are everything," he said with unnerving calm. Dr. Webb frowned, sensing something no one else could. In the fifth row, Deborah straightened up. She'd heard that tone before, right before David astonished everyone. "David," Vincent said, trying to regain control, "are you going to play or keep talking? People don't have all night." "Actually," David said, repositioning himself, "let's try something more instructive, something the audience can really learn from." Vincent barked a laugh. "Teach this audience? These are patrons who funded entire music academies. What could you possibly show us?" David faced the crowd. Though blind, it felt like he saw straight through them. "How about the difference between playing notes and playing meaning?" A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Some smirked, others looked irritated. "The nerve," Patricia Wells mumbled. "He thinks he knows more than professional performers." Vincent felt the situation slipping fast. He had to shut it down. "Fine," he said. "Since you want to teach, I'll give the lesson. I'll show you how this should sound." David stepped aside with a quiet smile, not nervous, but confident that everything was going to plan. Vincent sat and played with polished skill. Every phrase was precise, every rhythm impeccable. It was a showcase of technical mastery. Meanwhile, David closed his eyes, absorbing each detail, not just the notes, but the phrasing, the personality, the flaws. He cataloged every moment like a scholar. Deborah watched him with awe. She'd seen that look when David studied great pianists of the past, like they were puzzles waiting to be solved. Dr. Webb noticed it too, that calm before the storm, the stillness that comes from absolute preparation. Vincent ended with a grand gesture, clearly pleased. The crowd clapped. Some praised his technique and control. "And now," Vincent said with a smug bow, "let's hear your version of the impossible." David returned to the bench but didn't sit. He turned to the crowd. "Before I begin, I want to share something about what you just heard." Vincent frowned. "What now?" "Partita number 2 isn't just notes," David explained, his voice suddenly filled with gravity. "It's Bach's way of confronting grief, each part a stage of mourning." Several leaned in, captivated. "The first movement is denial. The music refuses the truth. The next is rage, against the world, against God, even against music." Vincent rolled his eyes. "That's basic knowledge. You're not impressing anyone." David smiled, this time a deeper, sadder smile. "Exactly. Anyone can learn history, but feeling it, living it, that's different." He sat, fingertips hovering over the keys. "The difference, Dr. Sterling, is you played what Bach wrote. I'm going to play what he felt." The silence was electrified. Everyone could sense something meaningful was about to unfold. In row 5, Deborah held her breath. This wasn't just about music. David was about to show his soul to a room that had treated him like a footnote. It was breathtaking and terrifying. Vincent stood uneasily beside him. The boy's calm energy, his sure posture, it all hinted the evening's narrative had just changed. David inhaled, closed his eyes. In his mind, he wasn't surrounded by the rich and judgmental. He was back in that hospital room 8 years ago, learning he'd never see his parents again. When his fingers struck the first chord, something in the room changed. These were the same notes, but they carried the weight of lived sorrow, deep loss, and unstoppable will. That's when everyone finally understood. They hadn't just misjudged David's skill, they'd missed the depth of his humanity. And now, with each note, he was about to give them a lesson in what music and true strength really sound like. The first notes that drifted from the piano made Vincent Sterling flinch. These weren't just the notes he had performed earlier, they had been reborn, infused with the soul of someone who had faced despair and found salvation in music. David played the partita like he was in conversation with Bach himself. Each phrase carried the burden of his own life, the crushing loss he faced at 8, the anger toward a society that dismissed him, and the quiet acceptance that made music sacred to him. "My God," Dr. Webb whispered, leaning forward. In his decades-long career, he had never heard such emotional force in a performance. Vincent's knees weakened. The boy's technique was not only perfect, it surpassed his own. Passages Vincent strained through flowed from David's hands like water, as effortless as a breath. Margaret Rothschild, who just minutes before had mocked the boy, now had tears tracing lines through her expensive makeup. David's playing wasn't just flawless, it was transformative. His music stirred something deep in her she'd long forgotten. How is this even possible?" Patricia Wells whispered to her assistant, her voice unsteady. But the answer wasn't spoken. It was heard in the sound. David wasn't simply performing the partita, he was living it. The first movement retold the story of a child who lost everything in a heartbeat. The second screamed with the fury of a young man forced to prove his worth to a world that never gave him a chance. Vincent watched, frozen, as his years of interpretation were effortlessly taken apart and rebuilt into something far more alive. What had once felt precise now felt hollow beside David's brilliance. As David entered the third movement, something unexplainable began to happen in the room. The part of the partita that represents transcendence took on a sacred air. He was no longer playing for the audience. He was playing through them, speaking to something inside each person. "Vincent," Dr. Webb said in awe. "This boy, this is one of the greatest gifts I've ever witnessed." Inside, Vincent cracked. It wasn't just his pride, it was the entire illusion of superiority he'd cultivated. The blind, black boy he mocked was more than talented, he was historic. The room sat in pure silence. The music had taken over. People who came to flaunt wealth were suddenly faced with truth, raw, unshakable, and undeniable. David neared the climax of the piece. That's when Vincent grasped the depth of his failure. Every note David played revealed years of discipline, study, and passion. This wasn't luck. This was brilliance, built from pain. "He remembered every word we said," Vincent whispered, shaken by the realization. Every mocking tone, every insult, David had cataloged it all. In the fifth row, Deborah Thompson smiled through tears. She had watched her nephew practice until his fingers bled, seen him read Braille scores until dawn, listened as he studied recordings of dead legends. Now the world was finally seeing what she always had. Vincent looked out over the crowd and saw his downfall in their faces. Margaret Rothschild stared at him with disgust. Dr. Webb's expression had shifted entirely. "How dare you?" Patricia Wells muttered, eyes fixed on Vincent. "Try to humiliate a boy with that kind of gift." Vincent opened his mouth to defend himself, but found no words. There was nothing he could say. He had tried to bury a miracle. David ended the partita with a grace that made the following silence feel holy. David's hands lingered on the keys, like he was sealing a final promise with the music. When he rose to face the crowd, there was no boast in his eyes, only peace. The ovation that followed wasn't applause, it was recognition, apology, celebration, all at once. Guests stood as if witnessing something sacred. Vincent remained still, his public image unraveling before him. Everyone now knew he had tried to silence a musical prodigy out of ego. In 15 minutes, David had dismantled what Vincent built over decades. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Webb said, approaching, eyes filled with disappointed judgment. "We'll need to talk about your future with the orchestra." Vincent saw Margaret Rothschild take out her phone. He didn't need to ask. He knew the word was already spreading. David walked up to Vincent, hand extended. "Thank you, Dr. Sterling. Sometimes we need to hear our own music to know who we are." Vincent shook his hand, numb with realization. What he'd witnessed was not just talent, it was the collapse of everything he thought made him superior. As David received applause and praise, Vincent, who had once tried to suppress a rising star, realized justice, like music, finds its way. 6 months later, David Thompson walked the halls of Juilliard, a full scholarship student. At 17, he was the youngest ever to earn that honor. Dr. Webb, who had seen that life-changing performance, ensured David received every opportunity he needed. Talent like this happens once in a generation, he told skeptics. David's practice room overlooked Central Park, a far cry from the damp church basement where it all began. His teachers didn't pity him, they revered him as a master in the making. Margaret Rothschild, who once scorned him, now personally funded his education and started a foundation for other underprivileged talents. He showed me that privilege without purpose is waste, she told the New York Times. Meanwhile, Vincent faced a different fate. His contracts disappeared one by one. A video of David's performance, and the cruelty that preceded it, had gone viral, garnering millions of views and blistering criticism. Vincent tried to escape to Europe, but the scandal followed. Critics questioned not just his playing, but his character. "Sterling hits every note," wrote The Guardian, but the soul we heard in that young boy was missing. Patricia Wells resigned after the scandal exposed her silence. The board made it clear. Elitism had no place in their vision. Deborah watched as her nephew tuned his new violin for a concert, not a guest appearance, but his own headline act. "Don't you feel angry about what happened?" she asked gently, watching him prepare with a borrowed Stradivarius from Rothschild's foundation. David smiled, his fingers gliding over the strings. "Auntie," he said softly, "Vincent Sterling gave me the greatest gift of my life. He gave me an audience." The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who tried to crush him had made him famous. That night at Carnegie Hall, David performed to a packed house. Critics, celebrities, and in the front row, Margaret Rothschild watched in awe. Vincent, alone in his apartment in Queens, saw the broadcast. Every note was a mirror showing him who he used to be. When David finished, performing the same partita that changed everything, he stepped to the microphone. "Music doesn't belong to us," he said. "It exists to connect hearts beyond appearance or background. That's true artistic democracy." The standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. Tears flowed. It wasn't just appreciation, it was transformation. A blind black boy had shattered every wall built against him and reminded the world that greatness isn't born in privilege. It thrives despite it. 2 years later, David released his debut album. It became the best-selling classical album of the decade. Vincent gave piano lessons at a small community school, his international career a memory. But the difference between them wasn't just success, it was purpose. David used his music to uplift others, launching programs in underserved areas. Vincent had used his to stand above others, until it crumbled beneath him. David's story became legend, not just for his ability, but for proving that art belongs to no class or color. And as he always told students facing injustice, the best revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. Leave your experiences in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true merit always overcomes empty privilege.